Hello, everyone. My name is Lyssa Royal Holt, and I'm really sorry that I could not be with you live for this event. So this is a pre-recorded channeled session that I'm going to do for you now, and I hope you enjoy it. I'll be back at the end to connect with you and say goodbye. It'll be just a moment while I go into the channeling state. I believe who you're going to hear from today is a being named Sasha, who I think many of you are familiar with. She is a Pleiadian being that I have been channeling since 1988. And she loves to talk about contact and kind of a psychosociologist perspective on the contact program on Earth. So we'll see what she has to share with you today, and I'll see you at the end. Thank you very much. Greetings to everyone. This is Sasha here. It is a great honor to have this time to share some information with you. And we hope that what we are going to share with you will really help you to gain a bird's eye perspective of the issue of contact, the issue of your relationship with extraterrestrial beings throughout time. And perhaps with this understanding, it will give you some insight into what is happening on your world now with contact and what is happening in the future in terms of where you are leading toward building future relationships with your extraterrestrial family. Okay, so we are going to cram a lot of information into this lecture. Feel free to take notes if you wish, or just allow yourself instead to just feel the energy of what we're transmitting, because we know for many of you that it may trigger some very, very old memories and maybe some very, very old emotions as well. All right, so the first thing we want to share with you then is the bigger picture. You'll find that very often we like to use metaphor to explain things because some of this information is very vast and difficult to digest, and language is so very limiting in that way. And so we find that metaphor is a way to really help you feel the concept that we are sharing rather than just intellectually understand it. So the metaphor that we want to start with then is something that all of you are very familiar with. It's the metaphor of the 4 seasons you have in your world. Now, I know some of you live in places perhaps where there are not 4 definitive seasons, but for many of you, for most of you, perhaps there are 4 seasons. So you understand the idea. And if we were to ask you then, what season came first? You really wouldn't be able to answer that question because you see it as cyclical. So planetary evolution is very, very similar to that idea. So we're going to look then at the idea of one complete cycle of seasons for your world. So we're going to make a drawing here on a whiteboard and we'll show it to you. We've drawn an oval here and we've separated it into 4 sections representing the idea of 4 seasons. Now, if you were to take a look at how long in your way of counting that it would take to travel the entire 4 seasons, you would come up with a very familiar number to many of you, which is 26,000 years. So that's a complete season of evolution. Now, for the purpose of this lecture, we're not going to get into why this is so, but there are very, very specific reasons for why it takes this long, and it has to do with your connection with galactic core. But that's not really the purpose of this lecture, so we're going to move on for now. All right. So that means then that you can separate these 4 seasons, totaling 26,000 years, into 2 main cycles of 13,000 years each. So we're going to write that on the whiteboard here. And you'll see we have a top section of 13,000 years and a bottom section of 13,000 years. Now, you, in the last 13,000 years on your world, have been in what we would call a sleep cycle or a dormant cycle. This would be, if we are to use the metaphor of seasons, it would be the autumn and winter cycles. So right now on your world, many of you know you are going through a big change. And so we could label that change in a way that uses the metaphor of the idea of winter. So winter has ended and the thaw has begun. So spring is beginning to spring on your world. And therefore, you are still kind of in this transitionary phase where you are waking up out of hibernation, so to speak. So if you look at the last 13,000 years on your world, then it has been a period of time where you have temporarily forgotten who you are, forgotten your relationship to the cosmos. And because you've forgotten who you are, you've forgotten who each other is, which is basically just a reflection of you. You are one unified consciousness of creation looking through many, many, many eyes. And that is one of the truths that you have forgotten. So in this awakening period now, you begin to remember this. And of course, as we say remember, we're not talking about remembering just with the intellect. It's very much more deeper than that. Okay, so let's rewind then 13,000 years. What was happening in the exact opposite part of the cycle 13,000 years ago? Well, first of all, we're going to draw here. I don't know if you'll be able to see it, but we have here a dot, which is delineating the crossing point from winter into spring. And this is the transition you are making now. 13,000 years ago, we've delineated the dot here, and that was the passage from summer into autumn. So the top section then, the top 13,000 years, which would have been 13,000 to 26,000 years ago, you might call this a high civilization period on your world. And it was a time period when humans were evolving, and they were evolving with assistance from their extraterrestrial family. Every planet goes through this type of evolutionary process. And most planets, species, don't necessarily go through the awakening process very quickly. They sometimes have to take several seasons of consciousness cycles in order to experience their final awakening that brings them into 4th density and 5th density beyond. So the last cycle then, 13,000 to 26,000 years ago, there was great hope humanity would awaken. And especially in the last section, which you might call summer section of the cycle, so many extraterrestrial beings were here assisting you in this awakening process to see if, in a sense, you could create enough momentum to awaken yourself as a species and openly join the galactic community. So at some point, as kind of expected, even though hopefully they were hoping not, the signs were there that you were going to enter the sleep cycle. And so that period of time then, roughly 13,000 to 15,000 years ago, the extraterrestrial family that was here spent a lot of time and a lot of energy training many of you. It's kind of like planting seeds in your consciousness that would be dormant seeds that would be watered here and there in the next 13,000 years through the autumn and the winter, but that when spring happens, once again, the seeds will have been well tended. And those of you who volunteered so long ago to plant those seeds within you are now watering them, and they're coming to fruition. So what you're seeing now with, you might call it the explosion or the awakening of consciousness on your world, is because of those seeds your extraterrestrial family helped you to plant so many years ago. Okay, so this is really the bigger picture. But there's a lot of other, how do we describe this? There's a lot of other challenges, let's say, that are part of an evolutionary process of any planetary species. You have to remember that 13,000 years ago, the extraterrestrial beings that were visiting your world at that time, while they were more advanced than you, they were still, let's say, young as a species, older than you, but still young. And therefore they were growing too, and they were learning their lessons from the interactions with you. Okay. So we're going to take a journey with you then. This is kind of like an emotional journey that we'll talk about what happened emotionally, both to you as a species, but also to your extraterrestrial family. Now, maybe it's obvious to some of you, but we really feel at this point it's important to point out that when we're talking about the extraterrestrial family that was here 13,000 years ago, many of them were you in other lifetimes. So you as extraterrestrials planted the seeds that you as humans are now carrying, and you as humans are now blooming. So this is how evolution continues. This is how you really never are separated from your galactic family, because remember, as we've said, there's really only one consciousness in creation looking through many eyes. And yet many lifetimes are lived still as this one consciousness expressing and looking through many eyes. Okay. So we're going to we have a lecture we want to give you that has two parts. And these two parts will talk about what you went through as a species, emotionally, as this separation with your galactic family happened 13,000 years ago, and where it is leading now, 13,000 years later. Okay, so we start then with the idea of relationship. The relationship between you and your extraterrestrial family 13,000 to 26,000 years ago was very close. However, you, being a very young species, at that time tended to view the relationship as one that is similar to a relationship between a parent and a child. There's nothing wrong with this. Actually, this is a very common thing for extraterrestrial species who go to younger species planets and work with them, and they willingly take on the role of parent, and they try to do their best, though, to help the species become sovereign in their own right. So this is what these beings were working with you primarily during that time. Now, we know some of you out there are wondering, who are these beings? And just as a side note, a lot of the work we do with this subject matter, we refer to two main groups. One, of course, is Pleiadian and another is Sirian. Now, there were other species here and there as well, but we would say those were the primary ones. We know on your world that there's lots of talk about Anunnaki and other labels for beings from this ancient time. And we would say also there is a lot of disinformation as well, and a lot of misunderstanding as well, not even necessarily disinformation. From our point of view, the idea of Anunnaki was not a species, it was a category of beings that represented those who came down from the heavens to the earth to assist humanity. So Anunnaki, in that sense, actually was made up of many different species, for those of you that care about those minute details. All right, back to the journey then. So relationship at that time was like the relationship of parent and child. And as you know, especially if you're parents on your world, this can be a very delicate and very fragile time, because very often there are misunderstandings on the part of the child mostly, but sometimes the parent as well, that can create the illusion of trauma, let's say. All right, so the relationship then, as we've said, like parent and child, or like master and disciple sometimes. So when it became understood that the planet was going to fall into a sleep cycle, that you were not going to awaken into a permanent fourth density and beyond state, then your extraterrestrial family at that time had to begin preparing you for that sleep cycle. And as we've mentioned before, this was a time of intense learning, intense teaching, intense seed planting. But then at some point, as you can imagine, the extraterrestrials had to leave the planet. Now, the big question is always why? Why? Sometimes you cannot understand why until you are in the place of having to make that decision. And it was an understanding that, having worked with many civilizations on many planets, not just Earth, that there's a pattern that happens. And the pattern is that when a planet begins falling into a sleep cycle, they begin to become, in a sense, unable to see the bigger picture, unable to connect with the universe without a layer of distortion. And so it becomes known then to many of us that rather than creating more distortion and more layers that have to be healed later, it's best for us to take a step back and allow you to deal with the seeds that have been planted in your own way. And for those of you who especially had maybe heavy-duty missions, if you will, of agreement to carry these seeds, to let you find your own way and support you gently and subtly when it is allowed. Okay, but suffice it to say, when the extraterrestrials left, there was a huge trauma. And the best way for you to understand what that is, especially if you're a parent, imagine if you had to leave a child. Imagine it from both angles. If you were a parent who had to leave a child, imagine the amount of guilt and self-loathing and self-punishment. Just because these are extraterrestrial beings doesn't mean they did not feel that pain too. And then imagine that from the point of view of the human being left behind, it was like being abandoned by a parent. Okay, so therein begins the layer of emotional trauma that you as a species have really been working through for 13,000 years. And now that you're crossing into springtime, all of those old wounds are being revisited. So what we're going to talk about right now, we like to call it the layers of forgetfulness. And we're going to talk about 7 layers that you went through to the deepest level of separation and then worked your way back to current time now to begin building a new relationship. So we've already talked about the first one, which is relationship. That's the starting point, let's say. The starting point was the relationship you had at that time, 13,000 to 26,000 years ago, with your extraterrestrial family. Then there was the leaving. So now we go to number 2. Number 2 is emotion. The raw emotion that was felt on both sides by that leaving. So from the point of view then of humans, we might as well speak mostly from that point of view, since we assume most of you watching are human, at least right now. That emotion was the pain of abandonment, which is one of the core wounds of consciousness, all the way back to separation from the source. So the separation by the cosmic parents created that raw wound that you sought to fill during a time when the memory of your true connection to the cosmos was fading. This is no easy task. Okay, so number 2 is emotion. Let's fall deeper and deeper now into distortion. So we go to number 3. Number 3 is belief or belief systems. So basically, again, using the analogy of a parent leaving a child. First, the child has the pain and the trauma on the emotional level, the raw wound. But then, in order to cope with the pain, the child has to begin to form beliefs to justify the leaving. Now, everyone is different, but very often the belief has to do with, well, I must have done something wrong. I must be a bad child for the parent to no longer love me. So these beliefs, even though when you look at them in the light of day, logically, you can see are not true, the emotional body doesn't know that. The emotional body embraces that belief because it's the only way to make sense of the pain. And so those beliefs become the foundation upon which you navigate your reality in times of forgetfulness. It's a way to cope. But as you can see, it is a very distorted way of coping. So there's a period of time then when you are, let's say, building your foundation of belief systems, and some time passes, and then you go into number 4. And we like to call number 4 the layer of nostalgia, meaning that finally, maybe some good memories, some good feelings of the good old days with your cosmic family begin to arise. And this can be somewhat of a dangerous layer, because it's a layer that is very emotionally driven, in the sense that you are longing and reaching for all the good and that getting of love from the outside. So you begin to, in a sense, inflate the relationship that now has become but a distant memory. And that leads to the layer of number 5, which we like to call mythology. So from that nostalgia then, and those good feelings, those inflated and maybe distorted feelings of the ancient past, now comes the building of myths. So on your world, as you know, there in every culture, there are myths about great beings, super beings, gods, whatever you want to call them, gods and goddesses. And you see strikingly that there are themes that repeat in many civilizations around your world. This is not a coincidence. It is this layer in action, this layer of the mythology, this layer of distorted memory trying to find its way out of the depths of the subconscious of your species so that you don't forget, but yet you can't quite remember. So mythology then plays a very important role. Even though it's based on distortion, it plays a very important role to help you know that something happened in the ancient past, even if you don't necessarily fully understand it from this season of sleep. And then that leads now we're going deeper and deeper. You could say it's the most separated part of third density when you are really, really, really in the deep sleep. Layer 6, we would call the layer of denial. So instead of the nostalgia and the excited mythology, now comes, in a sense, an almost angry denial. Oh, those stories, they're just stories from a primitive civilization. They have no basis in reality at all. And so this type of denial then pushes you deeper and deeper into a cave, if you will, in your own consciousness, where you separate yourself even further from the energies of the universe. Now, if we're to psychoanalyze it, if you will, from a very, very deep level, all of this is coping mechanisms. All of this has to do with trying to manage the original pain of the abandonment. This is very, very natural. And we've seen this actually in many civilizations as they are going through this type of evolutionary process that you are going through on your world. So it's not normal and it's common, but we do acknowledge it is very painful. My civilization went through something similar as well. Okay, and the final layer, the bottom of the barrel layer, if you will, number 7 would be the layer of repression. And this is where you push away individually and collectively anything that has to do with your connection to the universe. Now, on the surface, it looks like you do it because you are upholding your view of yourself as an intellectually rational being. So of course there's no extraterrestrials. Who would believe in that? But really that is a facade that is once again covering over the wound of the original pain of abandonment. Okay, so those deepest, we're going to add one more thing actually. When you go into the mythology, this is also the time when religions start to gain a foothold, because religions take mythology and try to make sense of it as a way to help people stay connected to the universe, but in a socially acceptable way, or in a way that the priests or the governments or whoever is running it wants to allow you, in a sense, that connection. Now, we know there's a lot of anger and hatred toward religions on your world. We're going to look at it a little bit more with compassion from the greater point of view, is that religion is a very distorted way of trying to help you maintain your connection to the universe. And it's a temporary thing during certain phases of the evolution of a planet. But when that planet begins to, in a sense, wake up out of the winter cycle, you find that the religious structure itself has to begin to change, because each individual then begins to learn how to cultivate their own relationship with the universe without needing a middleman, so to speak. Okay, so layer 7 then, repression. And you have a saying, perhaps, in your culture, we probably will not get it right, but it's something like, when you're at the bottom, there's no place else to go but up. So in that sense, then this idea of repression is the bottom of the barrel, the bottom layer. And through, we would say, the last maybe 300 years, but that's being very generous, the last 100 years, and then the last 50 years, and then really the last 10 years. There has been dramatic acceleration in terms of moving yourself back through the layers, back out of the darkness, so to speak, of that repression. And for example, if you look on your world, the last maybe 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, there has been a lot of interest in this idea of the old gods and goddesses being ETs. And this is a, let's say, a signpost that is showing you you're working your way back through these layers now. You're re-looking at mythology from a different point of view. And now you are starting to get in touch with the emotional body again in terms of missing your ET family. We've spoken to so many of you out there who sometimes even cry with the longing of missing who you know is real in the whole scheme of your galactic family. And that is a good sign too, because it means you are beginning to reawaken your emotional body, the love that you've had for these beings. And in some ways, we don't want to say forgiveness. Forgiveness is kind of a way a child might look at it, but you have matured enough at this point to know on a deep level to really know and understand the circumstances and not blame them anymore, but just see it as something that was necessary to happen that now is beginning to resolve itself. Okay, so we're going back now from mythology, nostalgia, belief. Many of you are examining your belief systems, especially belief systems about frightening and negative ETs and negative scenarios, conspiracy stuff. You're beginning to see that so much of that is the extraterrestrial energy viewed through the lens of your own wounds, rather than it being something very, very real. And then finally, the emotional body, once again, we're seeing that in so many of you being activated with contacts. And now we rest once again at number 1 on the list, which was relationship. This is where you are now as a species. You, as we've drawn in the whiteboard here, in the time period that you know of as 2012, 2011, the Mayans marked 2012, for example, as a very significant time, the ending of a calendar, so to speak. There's a reason for that. The reason for that is it marks the crossing point out of winter. That was the significance of, as the Mayans marked 2012, but the energy actually started coming before that. That, ever since that 2012 then, you have been really on a fast track of beginning to melt away and work on your belief systems, work on your judgments, on your old polarized belief systems about extraterrestrials, all of that being connected to the wounds from the past. And now you are beginning to form a new relationship. So around your world now, many of you know, there are so many contact groups who are doing contact work in various forms in many countries. Only 30 years ago, there were perhaps a few dozen on your world doing this kind of work. And now the numbers extend into the many thousands, if not millions. So in only 30 years, there has been a very big shift in terms of you beginning now to rebuild the relationship with your extraterrestrial family. This is, if we were to say in terms of the contact program on a wide scale, this is the most important thing right now, is building relationship. So we just went through what we call the layers of forgetfulness. So now we're going to talk about the layers of remembering. And this has to do with, let's call it like a roadmap for the future of your species. Now, when we say future, it's impossible to give you numbers. That is not really so important. What's more important is to understand the process, of what's happening, why it is happening, and what you can do to help facilitate the process in your own small way. Okay, so number one then, back to relationships. Now we go to number two. This is, we would say it's also very active right now on your world. It's something that your extraterrestrial friends are working very diligently with you on. And we would simply call this reception or receiving. And basically what this means is this. We as extraterrestrials, we're not just going to land in the baseball field and have you line up and shake our hands and something like that. The process of remembering who you are and remembering your connection to the cosmos is a sacred one. It's not a circus show in that sense. And so from our point of view, we treat it as a sacred process, because we can't really separate us from you, in the sense that your being willing to embrace us is part of your evolution. It's part of your healing. Therefore, the two are intricately entwined. And therefore, for something like that, it is a sacred process. So when we talk about reception and receiving, it is our way of beginning to energetically reach out to you. And depending on the person, that reaching out might be, for example, as you're seeing here, the channeling process. It might be CE5 or contact work. But it also might be something very, very subtle, like an energy flow. This is something we don't talk about that much, because in your terms, you might call it woo-woo, yes, because it's not substantial. But we very often will send out frequencies, let's say. Just like you might send out radio waves for a radio station. And we see who picks them up. And these waves are not informational necessarily. They're just energetic. And they provide a way for those of you that are ready to, in a sense, tune in to that radio station, begin to feel the energy that's being sent your way and interact with it as you wish or not. We have to also add to this that in the last 10 years, we have seen on your world the acceleration and the growth of so many people beginning to receive light language. And even though, you know, there's some criticism about it as being made up and things such as that, we're going to say, no, it is the human responding to the radio wave signals, so to speak, that the ETs are sending out. And language, being that it is so important for humans, is a way for you to ground the energy in this reality. It's a way for you to tangibly utilize the energy for whatever way is appropriate for you at that time. So this also is part of the receiving. So the receiving is happening in many ways. It's happening for some very strongly, for some subtly. But even if you are maybe one of the few who feel like you haven't received anything, we're going to challenge you to go deeper, to open yourself to more subtle energies in a different way, and just play and see what happens, because our hands are reached out. The energy is there. It's part of the contact program. Okay, so that's number 2. Number 3 has to do, we call it the sharing or exchange between us. So this is when, this phase happens when you have consciously accepted our presence and have begun building the relationship. So if you haven't done that yet, then this phase and the phase beyond, the phases beyond, are still in the future for you. But this has to do with how you exchange with these beings, how you share with them. How do you give part of your humanity, your experience to them? Now, this shows a maturity from the relationship 13,000 years ago, because it's no longer a relationship between a parent and a child, so to speak. That was one where the parent gives and the child receives for the most part. But now the relationship has matured to the point where, yes, the extraterrestrials may be giving a lot, and the humans, we've met some of you, feel, well, there's nothing I can give them. But you begin to work through that to know that just who you are has value. And you begin reaching out to them and touching them. This is as important for you as it is for them. This is relationship building. And this then leads to the next layer, which is a natural byproduct, which is the layer of trust. So if a parent leaves you, can you learn to trust them again? Therefore, now on your world, there's also this challenge to you to go beyond the old wounds, to go beyond the distorted belief systems and the fearful stories that you are fed very, very often. And can you begin to build a trust? But here's the difference in a mature relationship. An immature relationship is trusting the other person. A mature relationship is trusting yourself. Trusting yourself in relationship to that person. So you are then being invited to move to a more mature relationship with extraterrestrials that is based on trust. And there's an important aspect of this phase, because we mentioned before the idea that if you have distorted points of view of the universe and of negative beings, or points of view that are very, very polarized, then you will not really be able to go beyond this layer, because those distorted belief systems are your own unintegrated shadow. So this is why when we say now that these phases are building a mature relationship is one where each party of the relationship owns their own shadow aspects, owns their own distortions, their own negative belief systems, and gets to the root of them, so to speak, so that the way they see the world no longer is a reflection of those negative or distorted belief systems. So that's why this layer of trust, number 4, is kind of a jumping off point. For many, you might get stuck here, and that's okay. Evolution happens in its own natural time. But the single most important thing right now for humans to work with is to really look at their addiction to polarity, their addiction to, let's say, drama or fantastical stories that get you going, that get you mad at some group, for example, because all of that is a distraction. Remember, going back to the idea, it's really just one consciousness with many eyes, manifesting in many different ways. So it's all just yourself. In the end, all aspects, including those you call or label evil or dark, have to be integrated within. So this level of trust, then, this is one of the keys where you can't cheat, let's say. We'll use that term. And that this is where the rubber meets the road, where you have to really look at the separative belief systems that you still hold and move beyond them. Okay, let's take a drink and then we'll move forward. So now we're going to go to number 5. Let's say number 5 has 2 different parts to it. Part 1 is partnership and the roles of partnership. So this has to do with beginning to create an understanding of your own value. Remember, we were talking about how the child, when the child is abandoned, would blame itself and think the parent mustn't love me and I must have done something wrong, so I'm a bad person, so to speak, whatever the inner story is. So when you are building a new relationship from a mature place with the extraterrestrial species, then now you really need to look at and create a partnership based on agreed upon roles. So using the example of the channeling that you are seeing in front of you right now, the agreed upon roles are fairly obvious. Lyssa, the channel, has agreed to play the role to be a channel. And if she had really heavy judgments about herself or mistrust of herself, the role would be very hard to play. So therefore, she had to do a lot of inner work to be able to feel that she could do this role from a clear place. Sasha, the the energy that is speaking to you now. Our role in the partnership is to be the elder, if you will, the guide who gives her information or channels through her. And what you see is those two roles acting in a partnership that over now more than 30 years has become very balanced. In the old days, let's say 30 years ago, perhaps Sasha was carrying the load a little bit more as I was training her, so to speak. So the same is true with however you work with the extraterrestrial energies. Now, it's probably for most of you not going to be as obvious a relationship as you see in the channeling now. Your role might just be as receiver. But we would say, we're going to make a little joke, maybe it's not going to come across as a joke, but even if you see yourself as just a receiver, that's not really what you are, because receivers can never hold the charge. They always give it. In one way or another, they always give it. So even if you see yourself just as a receiver, no, in some way, you are still giving it. So we're going to look at then this idea of giving you a little bit of a homework assignment, all right? To just ponder these things that we have talked about and look to how, number one, you can increase your trust and increase your clarity and lessen your distortion. And two, how you can begin to understand and value your role as the receiver, or whatever your role is in your partnership with the beings that connect with you. Okay, now we're going to go to another layer, which is the layer we would call unconditional acceptance. This is when we're going to give you just a very simple analogy. Let's say you have a friend that is so different from you. Maybe they have opposite political views. Maybe they have opposite life experience. They're so different that on the surface, you might say, how could I be friends with that person? But let's say you know their heart. Somehow you've gotten to know who they are at their core, and all that outer stuff doesn't matter anymore. This is what we mean by unconditional acceptance. So as you've matured, you've begun this maturation process of your relationship, unconditional acceptance starts happening naturally as a byproduct of the maturation of that relationship. So you can imagine them, extraterrestrial beings might be quirky. Yes, they might, of course, they have very, very different life experiences. They might make choices that from a human point of view, you don't understand or agree with, but you can feel their heart. And maybe from their point of view, they don't understand why you human make the choice that you make. Usually the choices where you sabotage yourself. Yes, little ET humor there. And yet we see your hearts and we see the beauty in those hearts. And so it becomes two hearts connecting, not two fictional characters with all their beliefs and likes and dislikes connecting. It's two hearts connecting. And from there, unconditional acceptance naturally arises. So now we move to another layer, which again is a byproduct of the previous layers. So this one, number 7, we would call mirror reflection. And basically speaking, what this means is that when two hearts connect, without all the external stuff distracting from that. This is when you very clearly see that you are reflected in the other person, not the you that is the false personality, the you that is the being underneath the armor and the costume of the false personality. This phase is extremely important because this phase begins an integration process. Just a moment. Begins an integration process within you. Because when you see the reflection of yourself in another and you see its beauty, it becomes impossible within yourself to keep parts of yourself away that you are afraid of or that you dislike. So this process then of contact, of accepting the energy and the relationship with another being from another world, actually can, if you are working it in an aligned way, create a huge alchemical experience within yourself of integration. This is the phase when we see on other worlds who've gone through this process, this is when we see the planet starts shifting. So your planet right now has not done so because you are not really gotten to the point yet of being willing to see, number one, your shadows, number two, yourself and others. For some of you, yes, you've had moments of it, or it's an intellectual concept, but it becomes very, very different when you feel it. You're heading in that direction. It is so very exciting. The momentum of your world is moving you toward that direction. That is one of the reasons why there seems to be on the surface so much turmoil on your world right now. Because when you head toward integration, there's a lot of chaos before that integration because there's a lot of resistance before that integration. Okay, that's number 7. We're really challenging the channel's voice here. Hopefully you can hear us all right. Take another drink. Okay, so before we talked about the level of partnership, and we said that that was level 1, which was the roles. But now we go to level 2 of partnership. And level 2 of partnership is equality. And once again, now we're in the phase of this is byproducts. It's nothing you have to try to do. It actually happens naturally when you've moved yourself through the phases of your own integration. So when we say equality, what we mean is that even though you might play different roles, because you have seen each other as a mirror reflection, and you've come to understand, not intellectually only, but viscerally, that there's only one consciousness in creation looking through many eyes, then what comes naturally is the understanding and the wisdom that all of the players in these different costumes are equal in the role that they play. And that would be true then if you are working one-on-one, for example, or with an extraterrestrial group, that you and that being are equal in energy, playing very different roles. And the appreciation that can come from that equality is we're trying to find a dramatic word, heart rendering, let's say. That leads us to the next level, number 9, which is appreciation and gratitude. Now we've really moved to the heart level, because once you see that equality, that mirror reflection with another being, no matter how many arms they have, yes, or what planet they come from, and you've opened yourself and you're no longer protecting yourself, the appreciation and the gratitude for that relationship fills you to a degree that is very, very difficult to explain. It can only really be experienced. And we know many of you have had, let's say, glimmers of this. If you've been lucky, you've experienced it for longer and longer periods of time. But when you begin to have the glimmer of it, stay there if you can. Let yourself open, because that is how you're really going to understand about the universe, from this place of gratitude, not from this place of intellect. Intellect is a start, but it is not the whole journey. And finally, we reach the, well, we don't want to say it's an end layer, because actually this one never ends, but number 10 is the layer of unconditional love. On your world, you have poetry and songs and stories about love, always trying to understand it. And you have felt glimmers of it from a third density perspective, yes? But the kind of unconditional love we're talking about is nothing like humans have experienced up until this point. Maybe in spiritual experiences and meditations, you've had glimmers of it, but it's deeper and deeper, and it grows more and more immersive the more you allow yourself to open and let go of all of the trappings of a third density life. Now, for those of you, maybe we've mentioned this idea of third density and fourth density, but maybe some of you are not fully aware of what we're speaking of. Simply put, if you look at the idea of a rainbow, we're going to use an analogy here. You look at the idea of a rainbow, it starts off as white light, and then when light is shined through a prism, you see the 7 visible colors in the spectrum. Consciousness is the same. Your original state is as one, like the white light. But when consciousness chooses to go through a period of separation for its process of learning and growth and experience, it goes through a separation process that creates kind of like what you would call a spectrum, like a wavelength spectrum of energy. And there are 2 specific parts of the spectrum where physical embodied experience happens. One is third density, one is fourth density. Third density is the density where you are the most separated, where you forget who you are, where you forget that you're really the white light shining through a prism, so to speak. And that is where humanity has been for the last 13,000 years, a little bit longer than that too. And now, as you're crossing into from the springtime from winter, you're beginning to cross into the second part of the spectrum that we were talking about, the fourth density spectrum. This is a spectrum where instead of separation being the underlying energy, now integration is the underlying energy. So you're crossing now into this part of the spectrum, the energy wavelength spectrum, where integration is now the driving force of the energy. And again, that is another one of the reasons why you see so much chaos on your world, because the egos of third density don't like the idea of letting go of the control. They don't like the idea of moving into a more open and integrative experience. It's a natural response, but evolution cannot be stopped. Therefore, little by little, integration will happen on your world. And so when we speak then of unconditional love in this final layer of remembering, you're just starting to open yourself to receiving this kind of love from the universe. Now, notice the language we said, love from the universe. It's very third density language saying it's coming from outside of you. But the addition to that is you are the universe, and this love is you. So you open yourself to the love that you already are, that you have forgotten, but you are now remembering. This is why at this time now on Earth, all the contact programs are so very important. For contact is not going to happen in a controlled way by governments or organizations. It is already happening on a grassroots level with each and every one of you in your backyards, in your beds, in your living rooms, in your bathtubs, everywhere. And in the end, we hope you remember always that it is only another part of you contacting you. For you are one energy looking through multitudes of eyes. And we thank you so very much for allowing us to share this session with you. We hope that we have planted seeds that you can use in your life and in your own awakening process. And please trust, however dark it may look out there, it's always darkest before the dawn. Keep going, keep doing your work, and trust the process of evolution. From myself and also my contact team that has supported us in the background here, we're pointing over here, they're not over here, yes. But from all of us, you may have felt us during this session. We send you our greatest love, and we look forward to reuniting in the not too distant future. Lyssa will be back in a moment. Much love from all of us. I'm a little bit spacey, but thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the session. And if you want to find out any more about my work, you can go to my website, www.lyssaroyal.net. Thank you so much. And I'll see you out there, I hope. Much love from me too. Bye-bye.